It is wonderful to see you all here because on a rainy Thursday, we have a wonderful speaker today, and I'm sure you will be very happy you made the effort. This is the Plato Society's last colloquium of 2018, and we welcome you all here. I am Fred McLean, the president this year of the Plato Society. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Plato, we are a group of 400 intellectually curious people who meet regularly in or near Westwood Village for discussion groups and events such as this colloquium. If you're interested in learning more about Plato, we invite you to check at the table set up in the foyer, which has some additional, well, not only additional, but quite a bit of additional information about Plato, and includes a sign-up sheet if you are interested in visiting our facilities. With that, as I said, we've got a wonderful speaker who's been here before, and I think you will very much enjoy what he has to say. And I'm going to turn the program over to Jay Rakow, who's the chair of our colloquia, and he will introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Fred, and welcome everyone. We're very happy to have today for a return engagement one of our most popular speakers ever. Professor Dan Schner is a professor at the USC Annenberg School of Communications, as well as the UC Berkley Institute of Government Studies. He's taught at the JFK School of Government at Harvard, the George Washington University Graduate School of Political Management. He's a founder of the USC LA Times poll, which is a very good poll, an accurate poll. He's worked on 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, and he served as director of communications for the McCain 2000 campaign, as well as chairman in 2010 of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. He ran for Secretary of State of California in 2014 as a nonpartisan candidate. And so we're very thrilled to have him as our colloquium speaker. And I will also note that our next colloquium will be on January 17th, and our speaker will be Jennifer Kavanaugh of the Rand Institute, and she'll be talking about her latest book, Truth Decay: The Diminishing Role of Facts and Analysis in U.S. Public Life. A very interesting speaker as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our returning and favorite speaker, Dan Schner.
Thank you. Oh, thank you all very much. I'm especially pleased and I'm especially grateful to be invited to join you again. As I think I told you one of the previous times I was here, particularly in the immediate run-up and the immediate aftermath of an election, I'll get asked to talk to community groups around the LA region. But I very rarely get invited to talk to the same group twice. And by my count, this is a 4th invitation, which makes you the most optimistic gathering in all of Southern California. So I'm very impressed and I'm very flattered. Tolerant. One of the things that I learned in my last visit here, I'm not quite sure how it came up in a conversation about politics, but I learned that while there were few members of the Trojan Nation in the room today, there are actually a lot more Bruins. So I come in peace, particularly after this year's football extravaganza. But what I will tell you is this. It's a little-known fact, a true fact about the state of California, that if you were going to divide the state of California in half, if you were going to draw a line from the Pacific Ocean to the Nevada border to divide the state in half, not by geography, not by acres or by square miles, but if you were going to draw that line to divide the state in half by population, so you'd have 19.5 million people to the north of that line, 19.5 million people to the south of that line. If you were to draw that line, you would draw it not through Santa Barbara, not through Bakersfield. In fact, you would draw that line right through downtown Los Angeles. And in fact, more precisely, you would draw that line right down Wilshire Boulevard. So for all of my UCLA friends in the room, you all attended one of the finest universities in all of Northern California. And we should have no issue with you at all. Bring it up with Stanford, okay? Let's go on. So I'm very pleased to be back, because one of the nice things about being able to join this group is, and please take the compliment heartfelt, it is such a smart, such a well-read, such an intelligent gathering, that what I've learned over the few previous times I've come here is the less time that I spend talking and the more time that I spend listening, the better an experience it is for me. And so what I will do, if it is okay with you guys, is give a talk then a little bit shorter than normal to lay out some ideas and some concepts, particularly out of the recent midterm elections and what it means going forward. But from a purely selfish, if not greedy standpoint, I'd prefer that more of the time be question and answer and conversation, just because, like I said, when I've been here in the past, I've learned so much from all of you, so I hope you'll indulge me with that adjustment. So that said, let's talk a little bit about the midterms, which by latest count as of this morning are almost over. It's been said that only in California can you vote 1 month before the election and have to wait until 1 month after to find out who won. But we're getting closer. And even if there are still an occasional race here and there to be called, I think we have a pretty good idea, of course, of what happened at this point. And whether you call it a tidal wave or a tsunami, whether you call California a blue state or indigo, in either case, I think we have a pretty good sense of the trajectory and of the landscape, close enough to have a reasonably intelligent conversation about it. So I'll start, as I have with you in the past, by offering you a quote from one of my favorite authors. Mark Twain, of course, the famous humorist. Mark Twain once said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes." And I love that quote because it's such an important reminder to all of us, is that even though we don't experience the same sets of challenges identically to the way we have in the past, is that as time passes, and I imagine some of you learned the same lesson over the course of your adult lifetimes as I've learned in mine, is that even if those challenges aren't identical, there's similarities. And each time, whether it's politically or professionally or personally, every time you learn a little bit more from a challenge, you're a little bit better equipped to deal with it the next time that it came up. And so heading into this year's midterms, I felt probably more than I ever have in the years that I've been following American politics, that history was rhyming. And it was becoming more and more apparent to me in the days before the election how much themes that resonated from previous campaigns, from previous political eras, that might be able to help us understand to some degree exactly what we're seeing taking place before us in real time. Now, one of the things I love about coming here is that most of my students believe that ancient history began right after or just before Barack Obama was elected president. I tell them every once in a while in class I refer to the modern political era. And usually a few weeks into the semester, a student will raise her hand or his hand, and they'll ask me to clarify, to define. So, Professor Schnur, when you refer to the modern political era, what are you talking about? And I said, in my mind, the modern political era, the modern era, began on July 31st, 1963. That is the day that I was born. Anything that happened before that was prehistoric. Anything that happened since then was modern. And they think I'm joking, but that's on their midterm. So I do want to talk about, by my very subjective definition, I want to talk about modern political history. And what I'm going to start with is people who share the same kind of memories as I do of previous eras, previous generations of politics, and then to talk a little bit about how that applies on today's landscape. How many people in this room, I will ask, remember from the 1990s, during the time of Bill Clinton's and Dianne Feinstein's first elections to statewide and national office, how many of you remember the term soccer mom? Oh my gosh, it's so good to be home. Now, of course, a soccer mom, as all of you know, as all of you remember, was a coin termed by a group of really smart Democratic strategists who advised Bill Clinton in his 1992 presidential campaign. And Dianne Feinstein and a bunch of other very savvy Democrats adapted not just the terminology, but the strategic approach. And what Clinton did, what Feinstein did, what any number of what were then called New Democrats did, is they reached out to a group of economically successful but socially moderate voters who for many years had represented part of the most loyal base of the Republican Party because they had voted as economically successful voters. They tended to be more economically conservative voters and therefore tended to vote on their economic interests. And these voters, these parents, soccer moms and soccer dads, and the term, as all of you remember, comes from the idea that a parent of that era drove their kids to soccer practice in the family minivan, and yes, I did it too, just like many of you did. But the idea was to convince these economically successful, economically conservative suburban voters to deprioritize their economic interests and instead to raise to a higher level of priority their leanings on a range of social and cultural and environmental issues. And what Bill Clinton and Dianne Feinstein did, and it worked for the Democrats for many, many years, is they won over these suburban voters, these soccer moms and soccer dads, took them right out from under the nose of the Republicans and used it to build a base for a late 20th, early 21st century Democratic Party. Now, although the term didn't receive quite as much attention at the time, at the same time that the Democrats were identifying and targeting soccer moms, equally smart Republicans were identifying and targeting another voting cohort, who we'll call NASCAR dads. And at the same time, the Democratic candidates were convincing economically conservative, socially moderate voters to prioritize their social and cultural policy preferences over their economic interests. Republicans were doing the exact same thing in the other direction, identifying an equally large cohort of economically populist, blue-collar, working-class voters who were more culturally conservative, and convincing them, just as the Democrats did with the suburban parents, Republicans convinced these NASCAR parents to prioritize their social and cultural policy priorities. And so over the course of the last quarter of a century of American politics, the two parties essentially engineered a massive trade. And at least in the short to medium term, it was a pretty even trade, because there are just as many NASCAR dads as there are soccer moms. And to be clear, although there is a gender gap, which obviously we can talk about in just a little bit, NASCAR parents and soccer parents, that's a relatively even trade. And so for the short term and for the medium term, that worked out to be a fairly even trade, one of equal benefit to both parties. Now, as F. Scott Fitzgerald once said, one of his characters was asked how he lost his money, and Fitzgerald's character answered 2 ways. I lost it gradually and all at once. And by the same token, this trending in American politics, this prioritization in both parties of cultural and social issues over economic matters, well, it happened gradually, and then it happened all at once. And the first all at once, the first inflection point, was in the 2004 presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry, because that was the first election in American history in which the primary indicator of partisan voting behavior was something other than income. For our entire history, for our entire democracy, or at least since the advent of the modern two-party system, the single most reliable indicator of how someone would vote, Republican or Democrat, was based on income and financial resources. The more money you had, the more likely you were to be economically conservative, the more likely you were to vote Republican. The less you had in the way of financial resources, the more likely you were to lean toward a more distributionist approach to the economy, the more likely you were to vote Democratic. So since the advent of the two-party system, through the 2000 election, that was the single most reliable indicator on whether somebody would vote for a Republican or Democratic candidate for statewide or national office. And in 2004, that changed. And starting in 2004 to present day, the single most reliable indicator on partisan voting behavior is not income, is not financial resources. Rather, the most reliable indicator, predictor of whether someone will vote for a Democratic or Republican candidate is the frequency with which that individual attends religious services. If you attend religious services, church or synagogue, once a week or more, you are, at least in a pre-Trump era, and we'll come back to that in a minute too, 3-to-1 more likely to vote for a Bush, a McCain, or a Romney for president than a Democrat. If you attended religious services once a month or less, church or synagogue or other, you are just as likely to vote for a Democrat over a Republican. And I should tell you this, I come here not to judge anyone in their religious devotion one way or the other. I subscribe to the John Stewart school of Judaism, so I'm not all that religious, I'm just sort of Jewish. And so I don't judge anyone as being better or worse depending on how they exhibit their religious faith. But what's known as religiosity, not your religious leanings, but the intensity with which you adhere to those beliefs, has for the last 15 years been the single most reliable indicator of partisan voting behavior. That started in 2004, but I would suggest to you that earlier this month, we saw it reach its next, even greater inflection point. And I'm going to offer you some statistics in this regard. Married female voters, more specifically married female white voters, more specifically married female white voters with a college degree, voted for Democratic candidates for Congress this month by a 20-point margin over Republicans. That's more than twice the margin with which that voting cohort supported Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, and roughly 4 times the margins that existed during Barack Obama's 2 presidential election campaigns. So by a 20-point margin, 59% to 39%. Soccer moms, married female voters with a college education, voted Democrat. On the flip side, NASCAR dads, and again, we'll separate out minority voters for all sorts of reasons, at least for this portion of the conversation. A white male voter without a college education, or as we politely refer to them in society today, a working class white male. Working class white men voted for Republican candidates by even a greater margin, by between 30 and 35 points. So soccer moms voted by 20 points in one direction. NASCAR dads voted by more than 30 points in the other direction. Just to put that in some context, the 53-point spread between these two voter groups was greater than the differential between Caucasian voters and Latino voters in this election. So it's no secret. Every reporter, every analyst, every pundit, every professor, every voter understands and recognizes that we live in a divided nation. But with that, a little bit of help from the data, I think we get a sense of how extraordinary that division is, and how it breaks down not only on political, on demographic, and on educational grounds. Now, regardless of whether or not your party or your party's candidates happened to be victorious a few weeks ago, I would suggest to you that this overall trajectory, this de-emphasis on economic issues and a higher emphasis on social and cultural issues, I would argue to you that that's a problem. And just like I am not judging anyone's religiosity or the frequency of their attendance of religious services, I take no sides, at least in public, in the great cultural and social debates of the day. I've told you this before. I tell my students at the beginning of every semester that I leave my opinions outside of class. And my biggest frustration with higher education, at SC, at UCLA, at Berkeley, at Stanford, anywhere else, are professors who inflict their own ideologies and partisan preferences on their students. So I leave my issue preferences and my candidate preferences outside the classroom, and I'll leave them out today. But I will tell you that whether you happen to be pro-choice or pro-life, whether you happen to be a supporter of marriage equality or not, regardless of what your opinions are on climate change, I will tell you that, at least in my opinion, I'll explain why in a minute, I think this de-emphasis, this changing emphasis in both parties is not a good thing for our democracy. And it creates a set of challenges and a set of obstacles that we can overcome. But I think it's important for us to recognize those obstacles and the challenges so that we can overcome them. Why do I say that? Well, as I've talked to you about when I've come here before, one of the greatest challenges we face in modern day politics, not just here in the US but elsewhere, is the extraordinary, the overwhelming hyperpartisanship and polarization of our politics. When I started working on campaigns at the dawn of the modern era, or as I tell my students, a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, we subscribed to what was called the 80-20 rule. And the 80-20 rule, every smart or not so smart political operative knew, understood that you spend 80% of your time and 80% of your resources and 80% of your money talking to the middle 20% of the electorate. Because back in the 20th century, that's how you won elections. Well, for the most part, a political strategist who tried to do that today would not only be soundly defeated, but would be laughed right out of the profession. Because in a hyperpolarized, overly partisan political environment, that political center is disappearing. And that makes it harder and harder for government at any level to function the way it should. I tell my students, I tell them, I'm going to put this in terms that a USC student can understand. Watch it, Bruins. I say there's an essential difference between politics and football. And no, I'm not going to use that one in the spring, Bruin fans. I say in politics, the victories come in between the 40-yard lines. The victories come in between the 40-yard lines, and it doesn't matter how smart you are, or how determined you are, or how correct you are. But as long as you want to function in a democracy rather than a monarchy, you've got to be willing to come out of your own end zone. And maybe not come all the way to midfield, but at least to the space between the 40s to look for common ground, and that doesn't happen anymore. I would argue to you, and we can come back to this later if you like, I would argue to you that I believe that both George W. Bush and Barack Obama both accomplished admirable things as president. I do not believe, however, that either one of them was a successful president. And the reason I believe that is neither one of them came to office with the sufficient experience on how to build bipartisan coalitions, on how to reach across party lines. George W. Bush was the governor of a deep red state, in which even the only Democrats in that pre-Beto O'Rourke era were almost Republicans anyway, and Barack Obama was a state legislator in an equally deep blue state. Neither one of them learned how to work across party lines, the way a Lyndon Johnson, the way a Ronald Reagan, the way a Bill Clinton had in their presidencies. And I say that not to criticize them, but just to acknowledge that skill set of understanding that someone on the other side of midfield isn't your enemy, but someone you can work with on a certain number of issues, is rapidly becoming a lost art in American politics. It was not lost on me and should not be lost on you that when Barack Obama and John Boehner found themselves in their own minds helpless to avert a government shutdown not too many years ago, who did they turn to? Barack Obama turned to his vice president, Joe Biden. John Boehner turned to the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell. And Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, by virtue of their experience, found ways to work together across partisan and ideological boundaries in order to keep the ship of state sailing forward. Now, Joe Biden is a lot more liberal than I am, and Mitch McConnell is a lot more conservative. But that skill set, that muscle memory, simply does not exist to the same degree that it has in the past, and that's a problem for us. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why that exists. When I've come here before, we've talked a lot about what I call the iPhone nation. The idea that our technology allows us, our communications technological capabilities allow us to construct our own information environment. We're the most mobile society in the history of the planet, which means we self-select where we live in more and more ideologically homogeneous communities. The gerrymandering, the too many states with California as a noble exception, lapses to create districts which make it harder and harder for an elected official of either party to work across party lines. But I think there's something else going on here too, and this gets back to the switch from prior emphasizing economic issues versus social and cultural issues. If you and I, tell me your name, sir. Yeah.
I'm from Sweden, so it's Ulrika Gustafsson from Sweden.
Okay, well, so I'm going to have to come back with a parliamentary example in just a second. And I will, in the meantime, how about you, sir? Your name? Hal, okay. So let's say that Hal and I are negotiating in the state legislature. He wants to cut taxes by 6%. I want to cut taxes by 8%. What do? We cut taxes by 7%. Suppose it's another type of issue. Tell me your name next to Hal. Farrell? So Farrell and I are negotiating. One of us wants to increase education by 10%. One of us wants to increase education spending by 15%. I get someone who's better at math than me, hence the need for more education funding, and we settle on a 12.5% increase. It might not be quite that easy, but at least there's a statistical path laid out for us when we're talking fiscal and budgetary and economic issues that allows us to come to common ground. That's a lot harder to do. It's a lot harder to find that compromise spot when you're talking about whether two people of the same gender ought to be able to marry. When you're talking about under what circumstances abortion should be legal and publicly funded. And so as we move to a greater emphasis on social and cultural issues, we've made it harder on ourselves to find common ground. Now, if you as a conscientious voter believe that abortion rights or marriage equality or climate change or other social or cultural issues are more important than budgetary or economic matters, that is your prerogative, and I'm not going to try to talk you out of that. I'm not suggesting that this switch is wrong. My point is it creates a different set of challenges. It's a lot harder to compromise with someone on abortion or marriage equality than it is on tax cuts or education spending. And so what it means that we need to do as voters, and what our elected officials need to do and learn from us, is to essentially establish a new vocabulary and a new approach to governance that doesn't rely merely on splitting the difference, but relies on a broader conversation in order to achieve middle ground in a less statistically obvious but equally necessary way. So as the soccer moms head off in this direction, prioritizing a set of social and cultural issues, and as the NASCAR dads head off in the other, government stops working. And it stops working for a number of reasons. But it stops working because we, the voters, are telling our elected officials, don't give them an inch. And we can talk a little bit later, if you like, about who them is and how we've turned them not into opponents but into enemies as opposed to us. But as long as we tell our elected officials that we see no room for compromise, then it's awfully difficult for us to expect them to work together. When I was running the USC Times poll, and thank you for the nice words about it, when I was running that poll, we asked a set of questions on this. As a set of budgetary questions. We said, do you want your elected leaders to compromise in order to achieve budget and economic goals? And overwhelmingly, the respondents said yes, of course. 75, 80% said yes, we want our elected leaders to compromise if that's what, in order to get the job done. Then we asked Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, would you be willing to compromise on this particular issue in order to get the deal done? And less than 10% were willing to. So the lesson we learned, of course, is that most people love compromise as long as compromise is defined as the other person doing the compromising. And again, it's certainly not impossible for us to find common ground on social and cultural issues. We can all agree that the fewer abortions that take place in America, whether you happen to be pro-choice or pro-life, we can all agree that the fewer that happen ultimately is a good thing for society. But it's a harder path to find that middle ground. The data's not there, the statistics aren't there, it has to be conversation, it has to be listening. And because we spend so much time, all of us, talking to and listening to people who agree with us, we're much less willing to compromise. And so it shouldn't be surprising or angering to us when our elected officials follow our lead and refuse to do so as well. Now, here's the good news, and then we'll get to a conversation, because that's what I promised you. The good news is, and I bring this from the college campuses, not just from USC, by the way, but I've become part of a mentoring program at UCLA's Luskin School and met some extraordinarily smart young people over there too. So you Bruin grads ought to be very proud of them. But what I've learned in working with these Trojans and Bruins and Bears and so on, they approach politics differently than we do. And there are some downsides to that. One of the downsides, of course, is the millennial generation, or as you may know, we are now educating our college campuses, the post-millennial generation. I call them the Snapchat generation. And they don't like that, but then I tell them that Gen X and Baby Boom, if you think about it, are not particularly flattering terms either. And so over the next 50 or 60 years, they will get used to being the Snapchat generation, so just deal with it. Snapchatters, if you will, they vote in smaller numbers than we do. They vote in smaller numbers than any other generation in America today or in recent American history, and that's a problem. But before we judge them, it's also worth noting, and giving them necessary and appropriate credit, that millennial and post-millennial generation, while they vote in smaller numbers than our generations, they volunteer their time back into their communities at greater levels than any generation in modern American history. And so what I would argue to you that they are just as civically involved as we are, but they define civic engagement in different ways. For years, I would tell the students that while I believe, and I do, that volunteering was not just admirable, but that volunteering was noble, I said, if you really want to make change on a broader scale, you got to go inside those doors of power to make the change happen. I said, look, cleaning up a park is a wonderful thing to do, but you can only clean up so many parks. And what my students started to say back to me, these really smart millennials and post-millennials, they said, hey, at the end of the afternoon, I've got a clean park. What have you got in your political system, aside from anger and vitriol and gridlock and polarization? So what I've been trying to convince them is that it shouldn't be neither or, that while volunteering is noble, voting is necessary. And as they get older, the overwhelming majority of them will come to that conclusion on their own without the help from an old guy. But here's why I'm encouraged, even in this hyper-polarized, extraordinarily partisan environment, is when someone, young or old, volunteers, and I suspect those of you who volunteer in your communities will know exactly what I'm talking about. When you volunteer on behalf of a community goal, as opposed to working on behalf of a candidate or a political party, it's an essentially different dynamic. If I go to work for a candidate, Republican or Democrat, red or blue, vegetarian, libertarian, whatever it happens to be, I'm choosing a side. And I'm only spending time with people on my side. If I get involved in a community-based volunteer activity, like my students do, and I mentor at-risk youth, or I'm involved in community cleanups or neighborhood watches, bringing meals to those who are no longer able to navigate on their own, they're volunteering with a much broader ideological range of people. They're not just volunteering for a conservative Republican with other conservative Republicans or a progressive Democrat with other progressive Democrats. They're doing that mentoring program with liberals and conservatives, with pro-choice and pro-life individuals. And what they're learning is that because those young people might disagree with them on some issues, that doesn't make them evil. They're not stupid. They're that really neat person who volunteers with me to clean up the park on Saturday, who just happens to have a different position on an issue that's important to me than I do. And what I see with them as they move from the volunteer space into the more traditional political space is the lessons that they have learned from volunteering is that the walls aren't as high as we've told them they are. And as I said a moment ago, that somebody who disagrees with them isn't stupid or isn't evil. It's someone who's just as committed to their community as I am to mine. And I might not agree with them on everything, but I can certainly work hard enough to find some things on which we can work together. Some of you have heard me quote Ronald Reagan before on this point. Reagan once said that somebody who disagrees with me 20% of the time isn't my enemy. He's my 80% friend. And the coda that I offer to my students along those lines is I say somebody who disagrees with me 80% of the time isn't my enemy either. She's somebody I can work with 20% of the time. I just have to work that much harder to find that 20% and have to be willing to time and effort in order to do so. So we are a more divided society. We are a more polarized society. The good news is, as I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And this isn't the first time in our nation's history that we've been a divided country. It's happened before, and it's happened in much more venomous and much more violent ways than it is now. And good men and women have come to the same realization that many of us already are. That those differences are important, but they can be overcome. And I do happily bring news both from Westwood and from SC to let you know that even if we're a little bit slower to figuring out that it doesn't have to be this way, our next generation of leaders is figuring it out for themselves. And I take great heart in that. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for that great presentation. It seems to me in the last two presidential elections, more people were voting against the opposition than in favor of their candidate. Do you think in the next election, if we had less controversial candidates running, we might get more back to the issues and less to the individual?
Well, first let's assert that it would almost be impossible not to have less controversial candidates. But I think your broader point is a really important one. And there is data and there's research to back it up, not just in presidential elections, but more broadly. One of the most significant shifts in American politics over the last generation is that the majority of Democratic and Republican partisans alike no longer identify allegiance to their party, or I should say admiration to their party, as the primary motivation for their partisan leanings. Instead, it is either fear or, and I quote, hatred of the other party that strengthens those allegiances. I subscribe to the theory that many have offered, including the most recent former president, that the current president is less of a cause than a symptom of much broader political and societal trends that we face. And what Donald Trump realized when he decided to run for president is that he could tap into that hostility and he could tap into that suspicion, and he used it very, very effectively. The great unanswered question, the one that I don't pretend to know the answer to, not so much on policy but on communications and messaging approach, is if Donald Trump is a one-off aberration, an unusual candidate and under unusual circumstances in come 2020 or 2024, the political culture will sort of recalibrate itself to what we all became used to over the course of earlier parts of our lives? Or is Donald Trump, not ideologically, I don't mean as a conservative or as a liberal, but is Donald Trump in terms of messaging and communications approach a forerunner? And is what's in store for us an election in 2020 and 2024 and 2028 in which indulging those hostilities that you referred to becomes a candidate's preferred path to victory? I think the way to avoid that is not necessarily with less controversial candidates, but going back to the point that I made earlier about George W. Bush and Barack Obama, more politically experienced candidates. And I think a candidate who has worked in local and state government and spent a significant amount of time in Congress, who understands the benefits of finding bipartisan or multi-partisan solutions, and that person understands that running the type of scorched earth campaign that we saw in 2016 might get a candidate elected, but isn't going to allow him or allow her to accomplish very much once they get there. So I subscribe to your theory, but I think the answer is not a less controversial candidate, but a more experienced one. And who knows, maybe that ends up being the same thing.
I'm puzzled by the California Republican Party. At one time, they were able to get offices filled with Republicans. They haven't done that for a long time, and yet they're staying with the same hard right positions they've had, and I'm puzzled why they don't head toward the middle. Can you help us with that?
Well, you're asking someone who was a Republican for many years who became a no-party preference voter several years ago. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to address that question because I gave up. But here's what I would offer you. Most voters, I'll do this the other way, very few voters when they go to the polls say, I'm going to select a candidate that can help lay the groundwork for the long-term success of an abstract political organization that might or might not be of some help to me in my future. What they're more likely to say is, I really like that guy, or I really admire that gal. And so because most voters don't think about their selections in terms of broader political realignment, but they vote for the candidate who represents, they believe, their priorities, they're not going to have the kind of conversation with themselves that you just articulated. It's worth remembering that when Bill Clinton dragged, and I choose that for very specifically, when Bill Clinton dragged the Democratic Party kicking and screaming out of the Walter Mondale era closer to the political center, he didn't say to them, I want you to compromise on issues that are really important to you so it can help elect a candidate in another part of the country. He found a way to articulate a more centrist message in populist language. What the Republicans haven't been able to do, and George W. Bush pulled it off to some degree in his presidential campaigns, but what Republicans really haven't been able to do since Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign is to find a way to convince their voters to pursue centrist or even center-right policy goals by using conservative language in order to do so. The eat your spinach approach, why don't you be a moderate, it's good for you. That doesn't work. But what I think is particularly the challenge in California is the state's demographics have changed so rapidly that the state's longer-term remaining Republicans, I think, just haven't been able to adjust as quickly. And I don't say that as criticism. I don't adjust to things as quickly as I did when I was in my 20s either. But I'll offer you a statistic. In 1994, as many of you remember, there was a ballot initiative on which Californians voted, Proposition 187, which, had it been implemented, would have withheld government services from undocumented immigrants and their families. As you may remember, that initiative passed with roughly 60% of the vote, 59 point something, but it wasn't even close. 20 years later, in 2014, when I was still running the USC Times poll, we asked the question again. We asked about citizenship, we asked about comprehensive immigration reform, we asked about a wall, we asked all those questions. But we asked about 187, not by number. We said, do you believe that government services ought to be withheld from undocumented immigrants and their families? In 1994, 60 to 40 Californians said yes, those services should be withheld. In 2014, Californians said no by the exact same 60 to 40 margin. So a 20-point shift. And so to me what's fascinating, the one thing I'll offer to that is some of that shift is for reasons that you would not find surprising. The state's Latino population and the state's Asian Pacific population grew very significantly over those 20 years. And not every single Latino voter, not every single Asian Pacific voter opposed the withholding of those services, but not surprisingly, the strong majority did. Here's what might surprise you. When that question was put not just to minority voters from minority communities, but to young voters, the shift was just as profound. More specifically, among young white voters, among millennial Caucasians, they were just as opposed to withholding those services from undocumented immigrants and their families as the Latino and the Asian Pacific population were. And when we dug a little bit deeper, we found something that wouldn't surprise anyone in this room. These kids, our kids and our grandkids, they grew up in much more diverse, much less homogenous, much more multicultural communities. And it didn't occur to them that someone whose parents happened to come from Central or South America or Mexico or Cuba was any different than them. So, to your question about the Republican Party, the state of California changed, and it changed very rapidly. And the Republican Party didn't change with it. And until they do, they will not only be, as you've seen, not just the state's distant second party, but Republicans have now become the third party in California. There are fewer registered Republicans than there are no party preference voters. And unless Republicans begin to accelerate that adjustment process, I predict to you there will be a no party preference governor of California before another Republican is elected to that office.
Thank you. We always seem to focus mainly on national politics, the big picture. And I don't know that we focus enough on local and state politics. The old saying, all politics is local. I'm wondering what your thought is on the dramatic shift at the state and local level to Republicans after Obama's election, and what appears to be a swing back to the Democratic side in this election. Is there some significance, and should we and how do we pay more attention to that?
Boy, first of all, I think the premise of your question is exactly right. National politics is glamorous, it's exciting, it's on cable television, and really loud people yell at each other talking about it. So we tend to get drawn into that more and more. By the way, I have a rule we've implemented at home which might be of some use to those of you who get just as frustrated by cable television as we do. On one hand, we want the news. On the other hand, the analysis, the opinion, the screaming, the yelling, that gets kind of old. We now have what's called we call it our no panels rule. As long as a reporter or an anchor is looking at the camera, we listen to what she or he has to say. As soon as they show 5 or 6 or 8 people sitting at a long table, we're on to Netflix. But you're right, because even though it doesn't get nearly as much attention, I think your premise is the right one. All politics is local. And to me, one of the biggest changes that's happened in local politics is for years and years and years, national politics could be very partisan. But the old saying was, there's no Democratic or Republican way to fix a pothole. And at the local level, even people who happen to be registered in 2 parties found ways to work together. I remember some years ago giving a speech to California League of Cities. And one of the attendees was a man who'd been the mayor of one of the larger cities in the Inland Empire for many, many years. He said, Dan, I got a question for you. He goes, every year we send our best and our brightest, our most amazing young all-stars, our future leaders, our leaders of tomorrow. We send them to Sacramento, we send them to Washington. What happens to them once they get there? And the answer is that the further that the electeds get from their voters, and the more time they spend with each other, the easier it is to retreat into partisan cul-de-sacs. To me, what's somewhat alarming, it gets back to the point I was making earlier about increased polarization, is it's not just national politics. I said earlier that the old line was, there's no Democratic or Republican way to fix a pothole. Who would have thought 60 days ago that there was a Democrat or Republican way to fight a wildfire? And the fact that putting out a fire, whether in Paradise or in Malibu, could break down along Republican or Democratic lines would have just been inconceivable to me. But to me, it exacerbates the need for the type of bipartisan rapprochement that we're talking about. And I give Governor Brown a great deal of credit that when President Trump came to California, that Brown understood that there were some things that were of greater significance than partisan politics in the immediate. And even though he and President Trump disagreed on any number of things, they both were able to work through those, overlook those things in order to deal with the immediate emergency. What the future is on the local political landscape is a second question, and I want to be fair to the other people in the room, but I think the premise of your question is such an important one, I hope you'll excuse me addressing that rather than the specific, but somehow or other, that hardcore partisanship has permeated all the way down to local politics, which to me is more frustrating, but also illustrates, to me at least, the first steps on the path back. That was before we fix Washington or Sacramento, is that local leaders who still spend time with their constituents, I think, are probably equipped to take the first steps back toward a more multi-partisan approach.
Okay. In your opinion, what would the Democrats have to do? What would they have to change in order to achieve greater success among NASCAR dads? In other words, if you were to advise the Democrats, what would you advise?
So how can the Democrats reach those voters? Well, for the partisan Democrats in the room, the good news is there's plenty of members of the Democratic Party who already know how to do that. Joe Biden knows how to do that. Sherrod Brown knows how to do that. Amy Klobuchar knows how to do that. Tim Ryan, the congressman from Ohio, knows how to do that. And I think the common thread that unites them is not so much cultural conservatism, because Joe Biden does many, many things, but he is not a conservative, is a level of respect. Bill Clinton, who I think, even though he's fallen in some I know he's fallen in some disfavor in some circles in recent years, I still think Bill Clinton is one of the two most talented politicians of the no jokes modern political era. And Clinton gave a really important and very overlooked speech to the Democratic National Committee in the immediate aftermath of the Sandy Hook tragedy. He went to the Democratic National Committee to talk about gun control. He said, I'm with you on this. He goes, I'm with you on background checks. I'm with you on assault weapons. He goes, I've been with you every step of the way on every single one of these issues. He said, but I have a lot of friends back in Arkansas who don't agree with us on these issues. And our biggest problem, President Clinton said, is not that they don't agree with us. Our biggest problem is that they think that we think that they're stupid. And I have found, over the course of my life, not just in politics but elsewhere, that telling somebody how stupid they are is generally not an ideal way to begin convincing them to listen to my opinion. And a lot of times it's not intentional. Sometimes it is. But I think what Joe Biden does so well, what Sherrod Brown does so well, what Amy Klobuchar does so well, is show fundamental respect to somebody with a different social and cultural construct, and realizing that while it might not be, it's not better or worse than mine, but it is different and deserves the same respect that I would hope they would show to my cultural and social groundings.
Thank you very much for speaking today. I'm always so interested in the NASCAR dad category and why many working, not even before the big switch you were talking about with the soccer moms, why working class people would seem to be voting against their interests when they're Republicans.
Boy, it's such a good question. So why would a NASCAR parent of either gender vote on a social and cultural issue instead of their economic interest? Well, years ago, and many of you probably remember the book, I'm guessing that many of you read it, a very smart political scientist by the name of Thomas Frank wrote a book on that question. And the name of his book was framed as a question as well. The name of his book was, What's the Matter with Kansas? And his argument was, his question was very similar to yours, which is, why do these working class blue-collar Kansans deprioritize their economic interests to instead vote on issues like abortion and gun control? And I always thought that the political conversation would really benefit not just from more people reading Thomas Frank's book, but from somebody else writing a sequel to it. And I thought the sequel ought to be called, What's the Matter with Santa Monica? Or What's the Matter with Beverly Hills? Because, of course, in these communities, you have a group of voters I was talking about earlier who have decided to deprioritize their own economic interests in order to cast ballots for candidates who share their opinions on cultural and social priorities like abortion and guns and same-sex marriage. So I personally, as I think you gathered earlier, I tend to prioritize economic issues when I vote. But if I came across as judging anyone harshly or pejoratively who prioritizes otherwise, I apologize, because I certainly didn't intend to. That's your right, and as I said earlier, that's not anything that's wrong. It just recognizes the need for a different type of political conversation. But I think a pro-life factory worker comes to remarkably the same decision as a pro-choice Santa Monica nonprofit executive. Both recognize the importance of economic issues, but both at some point in their life have decided that there's a cultural and social value to them that's even more important than the economy and taxes. And to me, it gets back to the question this gentleman asked a moment ago, in which I shamelessly stole from Bill Clinton. I think the way you begin that conversation is by recognizing that there's a difference between being incorrect and being evil.
Nice. I have a comment and a question. Relative to Barack Obama's ability to do things bipartisanly, I think we all seem to forget there was a guy by the name of Mitch McConnell who immediately said that his first objective was not running the government, but to be sure Obama wasn't elected a second time. So I think you need to take that into account a little bit. My question, however, is there seems to be a very important role of women in politics now. A great number of women were elected in the midterms. And I wonder what your conclusion about what the future may bring.
Boy, I think any organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a community organization, or whether it's a political organization, that intentionally deprives itself of half or more of its talent pool is an organization that's not going to accomplish very much. And so although I think that the very impressive expansion and the number of female candidates who were elected to office this election is a really, really good and a really, really important thing, it's a mark of how far we have to come to recognize that even after these remarkable gains, women are still represented in our legislative bodies and our Congress at levels much, much smaller than the percentage of the population. So I think the elections were an important step in the right direction, but an important and small step that needs to be continued. I'd offer two thoughts on it, one, for lack of a better term, more philosophically, and one more practically, politically. Philosophically, there's a body of research that shows that female leaders, whether in politics or business or community organizations, or from my own experience, I can tell you in families, female leaders are much better, much more talented at identifying that common ground than male leaders are. If you accept my premise that somebody who disagrees with you 80% of the time isn't your enemy, but someone you can work with 20% of the time, female leaders have demonstrated in almost every profession that they're better at identifying that 20% and figuring out ways to work toward it. And so a more collaborative approach to leadership, I don't think is a magic answer. There is no magic answer to the challenges I described earlier. But I think, at the risk of gender stereotyping, even with a considerable amount of research behind me, the election of a large number of people to elected office who research shows are better equipped at collaboration, that can't help but to help. And so I find it to be a very encouraging sign. The other reason I find it to be an encouraging sign is something I see in my classes. Seeing a young person, particularly a young woman or a young person from a minority community, seeing them see someone with whom they can identify, achieve a level of success, is a really remarkable thing to watch. Because I can talk to a young woman in my class and tell her that she can accomplish anything she wants to. And she may listen to me. She may even believe me. But if she hears that from a woman 8 or 10 years older than her who just got elected to the California State Legislature, it's going to have a much, much greater impact than anything I could possibly say. I work with an organization, a really, really neat group called HOPE. And HOPE is an acronym for Hispanos, Organized for Political Equality. And this is a group of really, really impressive Latina business community and political leaders. And the reason I work with them is because I realize that no matter what I say or how well I prepare, I'm not going to be able to have the same impact in talking to a young person from their communities that they can be. And so if my help ends up being by remote control, helping them deliver that message as effectively as they possibly can, then that young woman who they're talking to, that little girl who they're talking to, is going to be that much more likely to take the next step so we increase the number of female representation to an even greater degree. More practically, and this is a quick one, while I stopped making predictions 2 years and 3 weeks ago, I will say somewhat timidly that while I'm not willing to predict that the Democratic nominee for president in 2020 will be a female, I would argue to you with some confidence that the female candidates who enter the race, all other things considered equal, start with a considerable advantage. Because Democratic primary voters demonstrated very, very conclusively in this election that they don't think there are nearly enough women in elected office. So that's not predicting an Elizabeth Warren or a Kamala Harris or a Kirsten Gillibrand or an Amy Klobuchar presidency, but it's me saying that any of them start with a built-in advantage given the results of the 2016 election. I saw you. We'll get to you.
Do I go?
Yeah, you're on.
You mentioned in the beginning about it took so long to determine the winners and losers in the California electoral process this year. Speaker Ryan mentioned this morning that it seems very funny that the Democrats won every delayed count in the state of California, implying, as they always do, that maybe everything wasn't 100%. I'd like your opinion why you think the write-in votes and the late count all fell to the Democrats.
Okay. So first of all, I don't think when Speaker Ryan talked about the outcome of the elections here in California, I don't think he used the word funny. And so whatever word he did use, outrageous, unfair, whatever it was, look, Paul Ryan's a very smart man who on this is very wrong. I grew up in the state of Wisconsin, which he represents. If you asked me to analyze Wisconsin legislative and congressional races from earlier this month, I probably wouldn't be able to do a very good job of it unless I happen to talk to somebody I know back there. Now, if I talk to my dad, the very progressive Democrat, Trotskyite that he is, he would probably give me a much different answer than my Make America Great Uncle Kerry would. But either way, I'd be relying on them. And so I suspect that Paul Ryan, a very smart man, talked to somebody out here who told him something that had Ryan himself had the opportunity to investigate, he would have realized wasn't outrageous and wasn't funny, but was rather a completely predictable result of the fact that young people and first-time voters tend to disproportionately be late voters, either on election day or mailing in their ballots on the last day or two before an election. Because California allows ballots that arrive within 3 days of an election to be counted, so even if they're mailed on the afternoon of an election, they can count. Somebody who votes at the last minute might not have their votes counted as quickly as someone who voted absentee a couple weeks before the election. Older voters tend to, not always as we know, older voters tend to be more Republican. they tend to vote earlier. And so it's not surprising that they had an advantage in these races which dissipated when the votes of younger people and first-time voters were counted. So there is a legitimate argument to be had about whether someone should be given a 3-day extra period to vote or not. Different conversation. But since that is the law of the land here, it shouldn't be surprising that younger and less experienced voters tend to take more advantage of that.
We have a question back here, and after that, we have time for just a couple more questions.
Thank you for speaking with us. And who do you think are the people who can beat Trump in 2020?
Who do I think could beat Trump in 2020? You know, it's funny. One of the things I decided after coming to speak to this group the first time is that speaking about the candidates was less interesting than speaking about the voters. And I think one of the things we've realized since 2016 is that speaking about the candidates can be pretty interesting too. As I mentioned to you, I swore off predictions just about 25 months ago now. But I've sworn off a lot of things over the years where I've broken my habits, so let me try to indulge. I'll start with this premise. First of all, there is no way, I will say, there is no way that Donald Trump can win re-election. You want to hear my second point before you clap? There is no way that Donald Trump can win re-election, but it is entirely within the capability of Democrats to lose the 2020 election. And I think to a large degree, that comes down to candidate selection. I mentioned earlier about how more polarized the electorate's become. And I talked about how in my political youth, we emphasized reaching out to the political center. And what both parties have decided over the years, Trump being at least to date the logical apogee of this, is the more time you spend motivating and inspiring your base, the more likely you are to succeed. I think Trump elections notwithstanding, we can talk about why if you like. I think base motivation is a tremendously effective way to win midterm elections, but it's very difficult to win a presidential election with just a motivated base and without having attracted a certain number of voters in the political center. The lesson the Republicans learned over the course of the Obama presidency is just that. The Tea Party brought them very significant congressional majorities, but it cost them 2 presidential elections by very wide margins. And I believe, and I'm absolutely ready to be proven wrong, that if the Democrats nominate a candidate who make my dad and stepmom, the proud Trotskyites of Madison, Wisconsin, over the moon excited, that is a very important step toward re-electing Donald Trump as president. And I do believe that a candidate who has demonstrated the ability in his or her past elections to reach out to the political center is one who is much more likely to succeed. Now, for those of you who remember, in 2015 there were 17 Republican presidential candidates. It is more than likely that there will be twice that many Democratic candidates by 2019. And I don't feel comfortable handicapping all 30 of them, although if you remember in 2015, they had 2 Republican debates, sort of the junior varsity and then the varsity. I don't know what they're going to do with 30 Democratic presidential candidates. You're going to have to do it like Hollywood Squares, where you just line them up across the... But without getting into each individual characteristic, I would say that for anybody who has a strong preference for a Democratic president come 2021, my advice would be to look at the histories of the candidates and those who demonstrated the most success at winning over the political center, at attracting NASCAR moms and dads, is probably the party's best recipe for success.
So my question is, if it is true that history is rhyming, is the Trump presidency rhyming with Nixon's? And if so, is it going to rhyme for the next year?
Well, I assume that question refers to Robert Mueller's work. John Dean was quoted somewhere about a month or two ago saying he believes that if Fox News had existed in 1974, that Richard Nixon would not have resigned the presidency, because he would have had the ability to communicate with his political base in a way that in the three-network era simply wasn't available to him. And I have talked to friends of mine who worked in the Clinton White House who believed that if MSNBC had existed during Bill Clinton's presidency, that he could have accomplished a great deal more because he would have been able to communicate more with his base. All jokes aside, I don't have any idea what Robert Mueller knows, and so therefore I have no idea whether the president will be impeached or not. I'll offer you two thoughts. One, it is worth remembering, as many people smarter than me have pointed out, that impeachment is not a legal standard. It is a political standard. And so what Mueller finds, I suspect, will more than likely lead to impeachment proceedings in the House, and at least before 2020, run into the same kind of brick wall in the Senate that the Clinton impeachment did, for the same reasons that it did, albeit in reverse. That said, though, let's go back to the rhyming question for a moment, because I give you credit because you thought about it in a very specific context. Let me address this more broadly, and for those of you who haven't read it, let me recommend probably the best book I've read this year. It's a book by John Meacham, the eminent historian. The book is called The Soul of America. And the premise of the book, and it's absolutely tremendous, is we might not have been here before, but we've been here before. That the sentiments and the anger and the divisiveness that we see roiling American society have existed in the United States from before there was a United States. And the tremendous thing about the book, what I expected when I first heard about it, I read about it last February and read that it wasn't coming out until May. I actually sent John Meacham an email. I said, I can't wait 90 days to read this book. Please send it to me now. And he was very gracious. He said, I can't do that legally, but he sent me a chapter, which was pretty phenomenal of him. Don't tell anybody, though. So the book I read about was, I think, what you're all thinking. Okay, we faced these challenges before, we've got them through them before, so it's all going to be okay. And like a lot of you, I needed to read that book. The book I got come May was a much better book and a much more important book than the one I expected. Because it wasn't a there, things will work out book. Rather, instead, what Meacham did brilliantly is he pointed to these episodes of the divisiveness and the vitriol and the hatred from earlier times in American history, some that you'd expect, the Reconstruction, the Japanese internment, and so on, some which you wouldn't think about, at least I wouldn't have thought about for a moment. 100 years ago, when the movie The Birth of a Nation was released, Meacham writes that there were 75 members of the United States House of Representatives, 75 United States congressmen, who were publicly declared members of the Ku Klux Klan. And Meacham doesn't just say, we've been here before and we've gotten past it, so we'll do it again. What he did instead is he said, here's how we got past it each time. How each time we as a country, we as a society face these kind of divisions and this kind of ugliness, here's how we overcame it. And so to me, and I think your question about Mueller is an important one, I think about this in a somewhat different context, which is not so much the president himself, but rather the landscape. And I do take some solace from smart people like Meacham who tell me that we have been here before, that we do get through it, but we don't get through it automatically. We don't get through it because good triumphs over evil and Gotham City will be safe once again. We get through it because really good men and really good women stand up and do really difficult things, because that's what it requires in order for a divided community to come back together. And one of those really difficult things that Meacham points out that we've already talked about is spending time talking to and listening to people with whom we disagree on things that are very, very important to us. Because if we only talk to our friends, we don't get any closer to midfield. So I do think history rhymes, but not without a lot of time and effort. And I would recommend Soul of America. Brilliant book.
Final question.
Yes, sir. Just a question on your, I guess you referred to them as the Snapchat generation that you see in these various classrooms. One of the distressing things to me about the midterm elections was there's relatively little discussion about what I perceive to be the massive damage to post-war institutions that have served us so well, and yet that didn't seem to receive that much coverage. Does the Snapchat generation, to use your term, value these institutions, and do they look for a leader who will protect and further those institutions?
Well, it's a tremendous question, and the short answer is no, they don't. But I will close, I think, on hopefully a somewhat more upbeat note than that. And for those of you who didn't read it, I would recommend David Brooks's column on this topic. It's either from this Tuesday or from last Friday, but within the last 7 days, Brooks wrote a column about the generational difference in attitudes toward the establishment. And what he essentially argues is that our generation sees these institutions as off course with a need for a course correction. These young people, and now I'm shifting from Brooks's analysis to my own, they've never seen these institutions work. So therefore, it's not surprising that they place much less value in them. You and I have seen each of these institutions at their best and at their worst. A really, really smart 20-year-old has never seen most of them work the way that they're supposed to. So it shouldn't surprise us, nor should it discourage us, that their initial instinct is going to be, we don't need them, we can replace them. And while on one hand that's troubling because we value these institutions, let's agree that while these institutions don't need replacing, they need renewing. And I think maybe someone like me, who's become a prisoner of my own biography, can actually benefit from listening to a young person who has a more insurrectionist attitude. Maybe they can rile me up a little bit, and maybe we can calm them down a little bit. So if we're able to point out to them not just how these things have worked in the past, because then I'm just an old guy talking to a young guy, not just talking about how these things have worked in the past, but how I think they can work again in the future. I have to, and it's the same conversations we were having earlier about the NASCAR parents, I have to show them the respect, not on why these institutions need to be destroyed, but on why they need to be renewed. So either absolute, don't touch this, or get rid of it, is an end zone answer. But the space in between the 40-yard lines doesn't just happen on a liberal to conservative scale. I think it happens on an institutional scale too. If you think about it, if you think about the most effective political leaders, and I'll say this for the last time today, of the modern era, I would argue to you that the most important commonality that Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan had as those two successful political leaders is both recognize that their respective institutions, in this case I'm talking about political parties, not what you're talking about, both Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton recognized that their parties were in desperate need of ideological renewal. Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980. 30 years before he ran for president, the most prominent Republican in the country was Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, who, among other things, was an avowed isolationist. Imagine if Ronald Reagan had run for president on Bob Taft's isolationist agenda. Wouldn't have gone very far. So he didn't reject the principles of conservatism. He updated them for the challenges of next generation. Bill Clinton, to me, is an even better fit for this discussion. He didn't reject the timeless principles of the Democratic Party, but he updated them because he had watched Walter Mondale and Michael Dukakis and others trying to run as Roosevelt and Truman Democrats. And he, Clinton, understood you don't reject those principles, you renew them and you build on them. And both were successful because they recognized that you don't tear it down, but you do have to renew and refresh. And I would say to you, to using those two examples, that coming back to our conversation about the current president, I believe as a former Republican, I don't believe that Donald Trump is a Republican. Donald Trump, and I say this neither is compliment or criticism, is a takeover artist. And Donald Trump recognized a political party that was ripe for a hostile takeover because it had not renewed itself, not rejected its ideological groundings, but hadn't renewed those ideological principles since 1980. and that a Democratic Party in 2020 is ripe for just that same type of hostile takeover, unless someone who's invested in the institution can articulate not a rejection but a renewal of its principles. So somewhere in between, when I was younger, I'm guessing many of you are the same way, when I was younger I was an absolutist. I believed in end zone politics. I believed in scorched earth. I fought till the dying breath for the things that I believed in. As you get older, you realize that the space in between the 40s might not get you everything you want, but it gets you pretty decent progress. And so just as I can approach a NASCAR or a soccer parent hopefully with a more open mind than I could have 20 years ago, if you and I can put aside our suspicions and talk to that 20-year-old with really new, exciting, and somewhat naive ideas, maybe we can pluck something valuable out of that and in the process convince them to invest in what we're doing rather than trying to replace it. Because I think all of us over the years have devoted too much time and too much effort, invested too much of ourselves in building our communities to leave them ripe for hostile takeover. And that means not just holding on to those things, but renewing them and teaching the next generation the value of it, to me, is the greatest gift that we can give to the next generation of leaders before they take on the responsibilities that we've held for so many years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan.